I'm from the philosophy department at Columbia University. It's a pleasure to be here. Today my talk will be about uncertainty in the context of pragmatist philosophy and rational choice theory. What is meant by uncertainty? Presumably, it is a term that has been used in a variety of ways. The present article focuses on some of the interesting relations between uncertainty and both pragmatist philosophy and rational choice theory. In the first section of the paper, I will be concerned primarily with the ways that uncertainty has been accommodated in the study of rational choice, and in particular, the ways in which attempts to accommodate uncertainty have motivated departures from the orthodox Bayesian tradition that finds its roots in the works of Frank Ramsey and L.J. Savage. The final section is concerned primarily with the ways that the aforementioned departures from the orthodox Bayesian tradition can be seen as arising from a commitment to pragmatist principles of the sort that are developed in the work of Charles Peirce and Isaac Levi. For the purposes of the present article, the meaning of the term decision theory will be restricted to a cluster of topics that concern synchronic standards of single-agent rationality as reflected in principles of rational choice. The development of expected utility theory forms the backbone of the intended cluster of topics. Even with its scope restricted in the manner that has just been described, the study of decision-making is relevant to a variety of fields: philosophy, psychology, statistics, and of course, economics. And it seems reasonable to assume that many people are interested in certain kinds of decisions, for example, financial decisions. But these considerations do not imply that there are any interesting theories of decision. For it may be that all of the interesting aspects of decision-making are so highly contextual that they resist non-trivial theorizing. Presumably, non-trivial theories must have some sort of relevance. There are at least three ways in which a given theory of decision might be relevant. It might be normatively relevant, providing a standard with which decisions ought to agree. It might be prescriptively relevant, providing techniques to improve decision-making. It might be descriptively relevant, providing a basis for explaining and predicting the behavior of decision-makers. There are various potential dependencies among these three sorts of relevance. It might be expected of a prescriptively relevant theory that it will help to bring decision-makers in line with the demands of a certain normatively relevant theory. It might be expected of a normatively relevant theory that it will be descriptively relevant in at least some situations. For example, those involving sophisticated decision-makers, at least in a pre-systematic sense, where the cognitive load does not impose too much of a burden on the decision-maker's computational capacities. In addition to questions concerning the way in which a theory of decision might be relevant, there are questions concerning the structure of such a theory. For example, what is required in order for a thing to qualify as a presentation of such a theory? Perhaps there are various things, for example, metaphors, diagrams, or equations, that could figure into such a presentation. Our focus in the present article is on formal theories. Such theories serve to determine a class of structures, for example, the models of the theory. In this sense, such theories may be viewed as part of ordinary mathematics, like group theory or topology. However, the theories at issue are not primarily of interest as pure mathematics. The central interest, as is typical in the budding field of formal epistemology, concerns the relevance of these structures to the world in which decisions are made. A given formal theory might be relevant in more than one of the ways mentioned above, but some of these ways might be regarded as more compelling than others. For example, optimization of transitive preferences might count as having some sort of normative relevance, even if, in light of empirical evidence, it is not regarded as having great descriptive relevance. Of the three notions of relevance that have been mentioned, it seems clear that normative concerns have dominated philosophical discussions of decision theory. This is not surprising, since norms of decision-making serve to circumscribe some important aspect of rationality, a topic of interest for philosophers. Such interest in rationality is often predicated on the thesis that agents ought to be rational, where the term rational denotes some suitably articulated standard for individual agents. For example, taking the term to mean expected utility maximizer yields the idea that agents ought to be expected utility maximizers. But why make such an assumption? Although a detailed examination of this sort of question is not appropriate for the present survey, a few brief remarks are in order. Hence, one possible justification for such an assumption is that there are reasons to believe that it is true. Such a justification requires that statements like agents ought to be rational, are truth value bearing, a matter that is hardly clear. Is the truth value of such a statement contingent upon the facts of the world? If so, then what can be said about the empirical content of a statement like agents ought to be rational? In contrast, if such statements are not contingent, then are they to be construed as necessary in some sense? If so, then what can be said about the principles of logic that will underwrite such necessity? This line of attack threatens to drag us into a Russian winter of old and difficult philosophical questions. In contrast to that which was just described, a rather different conception of the thesis at issue couches the discussion in terms of agent-relative notions rather than categorical ones. For example, it might be suggested that an agent who is committed to being rational is an agent who ought to be rational on pain of failing to live up to its commitments. The idea that one should live up to its commitments is taken here as constitutive of the very concept of having a commitment. The suggested move to commitments and reactions to it might be compared to those that are associated with certain aspects of the pragmatist tradition in epistemology, where, following Charles Peirce, the fixation of belief is central, and concerns with the pedigree of knowledge play a less substantial role. In both contexts, an agent-relative concept, for example, commitments or beliefs, is taken to provide sufficient foundation for further investigations into rational choice in general and epistemology in particular. To be sure, a move to commitments raises its own questions, with the first of these concerning the conditions that must be satisfied for there to be such commitments. One sort of answer to such questions maintains that whether or not a commitment is in place is a matter of psychological fact, although perhaps one that is only accessible through introspection. Leonard Savage's remarks concerning the status of his own subjective expected utility theory, as presented in The Foundations of Statistics, which is perhaps still the most influential book on decision theory, are worth recalling in connection with answers of the sort that was just described. So here I quote L.J. Savage. I'm about to build up a highly idealized theory of behavior. A rational person, I'm about to build up a highly idealized theory of the behavior of a rational person with respect to decisions. In doing so, I will of course have to ask you to agree with me that such and such maxims of behavior are rational. Insofar as rational means logical, there's no live question, and if I ask your leave there at all, it is only as a matter of form. But our person is going to have to make up his mind in situations in which criteria beyond the ordinary ones of logic will be necessary. So when certain maxims are presented for your consideration, you must ask yourself whether you try to behave in accordance with them, or to put it differently, how you would react if you noticed yourself violating them. The essence of Savage's position, as presented in the quoted passage, appears to be that the agent can introspect and determine if it is committed to the standard at issue. For example, following the suggestion made at the end of Savage's remarks, the agent has a commitment to a given standard at time t if at t the agent judges that it would seek appropriate therapy upon noticing itself violating that standard. Note that on such a view, an agent who is committed to a given standard at t might not satisfy that standard at t. The committed agent is, of course, obliged to seek therapy when it notices that it has failed to live up to its commitment, but that is a different matter. For example, an agent that is committed to L.J. Savage's theory could very well have weak preferences that are incompatible with it. However, so long as that commitment is in place, such an agent is obliged to take steps towards eliminating those incompatibilities when they are recognized by the agent. As discussed, decision theory, at least in its more formal branches, has been concerned with the problem of articulating standards of rational choice, and minimally, such standards serve to determine a class of structures. Let us now focus matters by considering the case of optimization, a standard that is assumed in much of contemporary decision theory. Roughly, an optimizing agent is one that, if offered a menu of alternatives, would constrain its selection to an alternative that it weakly prefers to all of the other alternatives on the given menu. Assuming a set of alternatives, and of which the menus of alternatives are subsets, and where weak preference on a menu is representable as a binary relation on that set, optimization might be seen as determining a subclass of a certain kind of structure, those consisting of, say, a specification of the alternatives, what counts as alternatives, what counts as a menu over such alternatives, the preferences over each of those menus, and some kind of notion of admissibility that is a set-valued choice function, which associates with each menu the set of alternatives that are admissible with respect to that menu. And somehow, preference optimization, in the way that I described, determines that subset for each menu. It is well known that in light of well-known revealed preference assumptions, or say postulates such as Sen's alpha or beta postulates, that we can drop explicit reference to the preferences and work explicitly with judgments of admissibility as represented by sets of set-value choice functions. That is, we can recapture or reveal the preference relation and take it as a defined notion. So from the current point of view, set-value choice functions give the appropriate model for the foundations of single-agent rationality. This is a thesis that I've questioned in other papers, and I'll return to later in this one. Optimization is often taken as a necessary principle of choice, but it is seldom taken as a sufficient one. In particular, it seems reasonable to many that a rational agent is minimally one that is disposed to restrict its selection to those alternatives that, given its beliefs, best serve its desires. But it is clear that the more general conception of optimization does not impose such a requirement, since the weak preferences being optimized are not required to have any connection with the agent's beliefs or desires. The requirement at issue needs to be made more precise if it is to do any heavy lifting. Various questions arise concerning what is meant by beliefs and desires, as well as the sense in which some alternatives best serve relative to such beliefs and desires. The most influential answers to these questions have come from the expected utility tradition. According to the simplest theories of this tradition, an alternative may be thought of as a kind of lottery, not unlike those that are run by various states as a way of funding social programs. And so the point here is that expected utility thought of as a theory of decision-making under risk applies to risky alternatives, that is, alternatives where there's an objective probability, whatever that means, an objective probability over the potential outcomes. Arguments concerning the normative relevance of the expected utility hypothesis, essentially the sort of decision theory under risk that was axiomatized by von Neumann and Morgenstern, have been offered in terms of various things such as the law of large numbers and self-evident axioms such as the ones offered by von Neumann and Morgenstern. Apart from reactions to examples such as those famously offered by Maurice Allais, there seems to be a wide consensus for expected utility maximization as the appropriate standard of rationality for decision-making under risk. That is, those instances of decision-making where the agent knows for each alternative the probabilities associated with the various possible outcomes of selecting that alternative. A significant limitation of this standard is that it is often the case that the decision-maker does not know all of the relevant probabilities. Cases in which the agent does not know all the relevant probabilities are said to involve uncertainty rather than risk. While various decision rules have been suggested for decision-making on uncertainty, for example, the security-oriented rules of the decision under ignorance, complete ignorance tradition, rules such as maximin that were investigated by statisticians like Wald, the most influential of the attempts to expand, the most influential theories for dealing with uncertainty extend the expected utility tradition to uncertainty by introducing subjective or personal probabilities in the absence of known objective probabilities. The introduction of subjective probabilities raises several interesting questions in the philosophy of probability. For example, what are these subjective probabilities supposed to represent? The standard answer, following Ramsey and Divinetti, is that these probabilities represent creedal states or degrees of belief. Assuming that rational agents have creedal states, why should every potential state of this sort be representable as a probability function? In response to such a question, it is customary to cite the Dutch book argument that purports to show that agents who have creedal states that violate the suggested standard can be exploited by a clever bookie. It is worth noting that the significance of such arguments are not only limited by their assumptions, but also by the fact that they can be adopted to support rival positions. Finally, what sorts of propositions are allowed to be in the domain of a subjective probability? For example, can a rational agent assign a degree of belief, as supposedly underwritten by the Dutch book argument, to statements concerning its own potential acts? Can a rational agent assign such degrees of belief to subjunctive conditionals? Further discussion of these questions, though interesting they might be, is beyond the scope of the present survey. Perhaps the most influential arguments against the assumption at issue, i.e. that every potential state of a rational agent can be represented by a numerically precise, every potential creedal state of a rational agent can be represented by a numerically precise probability distribution, locate the inadequacy of that assumption in connection with the role that creedal states are supposed to play within extensions of expected utility to cases of uncertainty. To appreciate these arguments, one must consider how alternatives are understood in the usual extensions of expected utility theory to decision-making under uncertainty. According to such extensions, such as in the account offered by L.J. Savage, an alternative is supposed to be viewed as a function from the set of possible states of nature to the set of possible consequences. Again, consequences are required to be, the desirability of the consequences is to be represented in terms of a cardinal utility function, and this time, in the absence of objective probabilities over the states of nature, we have a subjective creedal probability. Savage, as well as others, have offered axiomatic foundations for the extension of expected utility theory to decision-making under uncertainty. However, the normative status of such extensions has been called into question by examples of the sort made famous by Daniel Ellsberg, and to some extent anticipated by both Keynes and Knight. These examples purport to show instances of rational choice in the pre-theoretical sense, which cannot be reconciled with Savage's axioms or any of the other familiar axiomatizations of subjective expected utility theory. There are two sorts of axioms that are of particular concern here. Those of the first require that agents satisfy optimization, i.e. that the agent has a complete ranking of the alternatives and is disposed to select an alternative that is optimal with respect to this ranking. Axioms of the second sort are independence assumptions, similar to what can be found throughout the general literature on additive models. Roughly, in the context at issue, the relevant independent assumptions can be seen as requiring that states where acts F and G agree have no bearing on the agent's preferences concerning these acts, since if one of the states of agreement obtains, then the outcome is a sure thing in the sense that it does not depend on whether F or G is chosen. These two types of conditions, ordering and independence, are of particular concern in relation to Ellsberg-type examples, because such examples are supposed to demonstrate instances of rational choice that must violate at least one of them. While most of the theoretical options that have been offered in light of such examples maintain the assumption of optimization against a complete ordering, and thus must relax the independence requirement in order to accommodate the Ellsberg examples, others have argued that that the best theoretical option is to abandon the idea that rationality is optimization against a complete ranking of alternatives. Though demonstrably outside of the preference-based tradition of optimization, as they allow violations of the alpha and beta conditions mentioned before, conditions due to Sen, theories of the sort offered by Isaac Levi can still be understood in terms of the more general notions of admissibility as represented by set-valued choice functions. Okay, now I'm going to turn to pragmatism and connect to the discussion that has just been given. The previous section culminated with a brief discussion of some of the central difficulties that are associated with extending the expected utility hypothesis to decision-making under uncertainty. In particular, difficulties associated with the Ellsberg examples can be used to motivate various alternatives to subjective expected utility theory. These alternative accounts differ from each other in significant ways. Levi's account abandons the classical framework of optimization in contrast to those accounts that accommodate Ellsberg-type examples by relaxing independence assumptions while still remaining within the classical preference-based framework of optimization. Yet common to each of these alternatives is that they exploit indeterminate probabilities, which are represented as sets of probability distributions. Early in the previous section, it was observed that mere optimization is insufficient as a standard of individual rational choice, since it does not require any connection between an agent's preferences, which are the things being optimized, and that agent's beliefs and desires. In the expected utility tradition, a rational agent's beliefs and desires are representable by a numerically precise probability function and a cardinal utility function, respectively. These two functions are the sole inputs to the decision rule of expected utility theory. Although Levi's account is unique in that unique among the main alternatives to subjective expected utility theory in that it abandons optimization, each of these accounts can be seen as abandoning the Bayesian dogma that the rational agent's belief state can be represented by a numerically precise probability distribution. Despite significant differences between them, these alternatives to subjective expected utility theory each presuppose some antecedent judgment that is representable by a set of probability distributions. This raises the question as to whether these antecedent judgments can be motivated independently of the judgments of admissibility that they are supposed to inform. We now turn to one such motivation that is due to Isaac Levi, but finds its roots in the pragmatist tradition of C.S. Peirce. I began by drawing on a discussion by the Peirce scholar Eric Olson, and recall the relevant part of Peirce's philosophy, namely his injunction against roadblocks in the path of inquiry. And here I quote Peirce: "Although it is better to be methodological in our investigations and to consider the economics of research, yet there is no positive sin against logic in trying any theory which may come into our heads, so long as it is adapted in such a sense as to permit the investigation to go on unimpeded and undiscouraged. On the other hand, to set up a philosophy which barricades the road of further advance towards the truth is the one unpardonable offense in reasoning, as it is also the one to which most metaphysicians have in all ages shown themselves the most addicted." Very classic Peirce, if you've read some C.S. Peirce. Isaac Levi's arguments against the Bayesian orthodoxy, in particular the Bayesian commitment to numerically precise probabilities, can be seen as rooted in his reconstruction of Peirce's injunction. Roughly, Levi's argument is that the Bayesian framework does not provide sufficiently neutral perspectives from which the agent can entertain rival theories. For example, the various statistical hypotheses that are compatible with the information that the agent is given in Ellsberg-type scenarios. The introduction of indeterminate probabilities addresses this difficulty. Thus, confronted with the prospect of a single random selection from an urn that is known to be filled with exactly 100 balls, which are identical to each other in all respects except that some are black and some are white, and where nothing is known about the ratio of black balls to white balls in the urn, the good Bayesian's creedal state concerning the two possible outcomes should be representable as a numerically precise probability. Thinking of the various candidate distributions as rival statistical hypotheses, our good Bayesian rules out all but one of these hypotheses, the one corresponding to its subjective probability, despite the fact that each of the candidate distributions is compatible with all that is known about the urn. In this sense, the Bayesian orthodoxy urges a violation of Peirce's injunction. The strict Bayesian framework blocks paths that would allow the agent to coherently entertain statistical hypotheses that are compatible or that are incompatible with its subjective probability distribution. In contrast, the introduction of indeterminate probabilities allows for creedal states, for example, the one represented by the set of all candidate distributions, from which the agent can coherently entertain the entire range of statistical hypotheses that are consistent with all that it knows about the urn. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I see I'm running a bit short on time, so I'm going to skip ahead. Levi has argued in his 1974 paper that one can motivate the introduction of imprecise probabilities by appealing to Peircean pragmatism. I have argued in other work that in this way, Levi, through his decision theory, is led to abandon the classical framework of optimization. This moves the ball towards a consideration of admissibility as the primary focal point for articulating theories of individual rationality. I have, in other work, suggested that we must instead focus on conditional judgments of admissibility. In my other work, I've argued for the shift to conditional judgments of admissibility on grounds that appeal to issues from rational choice. Now, the question is, can the move to conditional judgments of admissibility also be motivated through an appeal to Peircean pragmatism? I believe that this question can be answered in the affirmative, and I will attempt to sketch the relevant motivation in the remainder of the present article. First, I quote Peirce: "The irritation of doubt causes a struggle to attain a state of belief. I shall term this struggle inquiry, though it must be admitted that it is not a very apt designation at times. The irritation of doubt is the only immediate motive for the struggle to attain belief. It is certainly best for us that our beliefs should be such as may truly guide our actions so as to satisfy our desires, and this reflection will make us reject every belief which does not seem to have been so formed as to ensure this result. But it will only do so by creating a doubt in the place of that belief. With the doubt, therefore, the struggle begins, and with the cessation of doubt, it ends." This is from Peirce's famous fixation of belief. So what does Peirce mean in suggesting that doubt is an irritant? At various places, Peirce suggests that doubt is some sort of obstacle to action. The following passage, due to Cheryl Mezek, a noted Peirce scholar, supports such a reading. Mezek writes, "What is wrong with this state of doubt is not that it is psychologically uncomfortable, but that it leads to a paralysis of action. An inquirer has some end in view, and two different and inconsistent lines of action present themselves, bringing action to a halt. In addition to reminding us that Peirce's belief-doubt model of inquiry is intended as a branch of logic as opposed to a branch of psychology, Misek's remarks suggest that doubt, at least in the Peircean sense, interferes with some aspect of decision-making. We can consider at least two ways in which doubt might interfere with an admissibility-based account of rational decision-making. Recall that according to an account of this sort, a decision-maker's state at time t determines a distinguished structure consisting of a non-empty set of things that could serve as alternatives, a set of potential menus over those alternatives, and a set value choice function which associates for each menu the set of admissible options in that menu. One way in which doubt might interfere with an admissibility-based account is if its type-level requirements, i.e. that the decision-maker's state at time t determines such a structure, fail to cohere with the relevant notion of agency. More specifically, such inference would suggest a relevant notion of agency, according to which a decision-maker's state need not determine a distinguished structure of the appropriate type, so long as that state is not free from doubt. This kind of interference will not be considered here, if for no other reason that the type-level requirements of an admissibility account are modest relative to what is typically assumed of agents in theoretical work on rational choice. A second way in which doubt might interfere with an admissibility-based account of rational decision-making is if its proposition-level requirements, for example, conditions like alpha and beta that can be construed as statements about structures that satisfy the aforementioned type requirements, fail to cohere with the relevant notion of agency. More specifically, such interference would suggest a relevant notion of agency according to which a decision-maker's state always determines a distinguished structure of the appropriate type, but so long as that state is not free from doubt, the structure that it determines need not satisfy the propositional level requirements. For example, in states that are not free from doubt, the associated structure might violate Senn's alpha property. Yet how, according to this picture, are the potential violations of the propositional level requirements made salient to the inquiring agent itself, as presumably must be the case if doubt is to irritate in the sense that Peirce requires? It seems that in order to make these potential violations salient to the inquiring agent itself, one must assume that such an agent is capable of making conditional judgments of admissibility. In particular, it seems that such an agent must, at time t, be capable of judging admissibility on the supposition that it is in a certain state that is free from doubt, be capable of judging admissibility on the supposition that it is in a certain state that is not free from doubt, and be capable of recognizing the sense in which the proposition level requirements of the given admissibility account are satisfied under the first supposition and violated under the second. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Next up is Professor Sebastiano Maffettone.
I have a PowerPoint, he knows. The lights, perhaps. Great. Before I begin, let me say that it's a real pleasure to participate in this conference. I believe many of us do think that economics should not be only about having more, but rather about living better. But we do think so, usually, privately. Great merit of this conference has been to make it public and shared, in this way, critical. So thank you very much for the invitation, the opportunity. As you see, the title of my presentation is Toward a Moral Dimension of Economics. In an article published by First Things, Edmund Phelps said that the foundation of economics must be based on a moral dimension, from which the title of my presentation. According to him, a proper understanding of the morality of economics requires an investigation into human nature. I mean, I agree with this general goal, but I'll try to pursue it in a rather different way. The main difference with Phelps' goal is that I see one fundamental methodological, ethical, and political reason behind the difficulty to recognize a moral dimension to economics. This difficulty consists in some misinterpretations of individualism. In particular, I indicate two of these misinterpretations. The first, individualism must not be seen in terms of pure subjectivism. We will see what it means. Second, individualism should not be confused with egoism. Let's go to the first misinterpretation of individualism. I think that to understand what I mean, we have to go through an investigation into the theory of value. Standard theories of values in ethics and economics are often reciprocally incoherent, being usually objectivist in ethics and subjectivist in economics. And I think economists should take more seriously the ethical analysis of the foundation of economics, abandoning the preferentialist subjectivism on which they often rely. We'll see afterward what I mean by preferentialism, which I admit is a bizarre word. On the other side, and this is different from Phelps, I'm rather skeptical about the possibility to construe a moral dimension of economics, starting with an interpretation of human nature. The reason for my skepticism on this point is a rather standard concern for pluralism. As I said before, the second way to misinterpret individualism is by construing individualism as a declination of egoism. I'll try to argue for this thesis in 4 steps, or 4 sections, if you prefer. In the first section, that I will bypass for reasons of time, I will discuss some, I will not, as a matter of fact, discuss some foundational aspects of business ethics and corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is now both widespread and controversial. I think it's controversial not only as a strategy, but also for foundational reasons. These foundational reasons being connected with the moral dimension of economics. That's why they're relevant to my present discussion. In the second section, or second step, which is the core business of the paper in some way, I treat relationships between 2 realms of different imperatives, the economic and the moral imperatives, both present, by the way, in corporate social responsibility. My thesis is that the logics embodied in these 2 realms are often at odds, and I think we should convince economists, perhaps not the economists present here, but many economists, to accept part of the objective theory of value inspired by ethics. According to many, this is a reason to resist to the temptation to accept part of the objective theory of ethics in economics. There could be problems with personal liberty if we take up an objective theory of value. I mean, say, if you are too objectivist on value, you lose personal freedoms. To avoid such a risk, I will try to propose a liberal model in which a critical view of individualism and an objective theory of value are compatible with free choices of person. To be more transparent, at least for political philosophers, the model is based on the well-known Rawlsian antinomy, or combination of the good and the right. In the first section, I will discuss exactly the good and the right, maintaining that society as collective enterprise cannot be limited to the personal pursuit of the good and cannot overcome the relational, non-individualistic limits imposed by the right. The thesis being that these limits, non-individualistic and relational as I call them, are inspired by an objective theory of value, but respect pluralism. To show why and how, I briefly discuss the encyclical letter by the Pope Benedict XVI, Caritas in Veritate. I thought something for Rome should have been exported in this occasion. And of course, it's not just Roman, but I mean, as you understand, in Rome is particularly popular, to try to show how an objective theory of value, and in this case a theory of good, based on what Professor Phelps calls an interpretation of human nature, in this case a Catholic reading of it, risks to be incompatible with a liberal vision of justice. I mean, the assumption is that you need an objective theory of value, at least in part, but this theory must be compatible with individual freedom. And if you take a theory like the good, like the one expressed in Caritas in Veritate, which, by the way, is exactly on corporate social responsibility, you lose the liberalism that we want in the theory. Finally, the fourth and last section, connected with the second misinterpretation of individualism, which is implicit in some way both in ethics and in economics, namely the one that brings individualism near to egoism. Again, here, according to many, such a proposal runs the risk of throwing away the baby with the dirty water, in the sense that you don't like, perhaps, in egoism, but you don't want to miss the advantages of individualism, including personal freedoms we all cherish. I maintain that there is another, more liberal possibility to distinguish between individualism and egoism in terms of dialectics between the reasonable and the rational. I guess I use the Rolson dictionary, which is not strictly necessary to maintain the thesis, but I think it makes it a little bit more transparent, at least for people who used to read political philosophy. So there are two logics at stake, the logic of ethicists and the logic of the economist. And they often reciprocally are in conflict. I don't think there is a proper contradiction. It's just a tension between these two logics. I here oversimplify a lot because it's obvious that it's not exactly like I state. I mean, there are many kinds of logics, both in ethics and economics. But I assume that very often the logic of the ethicists consists in a model inspired by a deontological background. Again, there are other backgrounds, and there are many kinds of deontology. But to be simplistic, I think it helps to understand the argument. That's why I force this interpretation. This deontology provides moral objective rules for economic behavior, rules often derived by standards of social justice and human rights. On the contrary, and this explains why they're in conflict, at least potentially, the logic of the economists is prevalently influenced by some variant of neoclassical economics. Of course, I know that exist people like Marx and Keynes, but still, I think that the mainstream economics is based on neoclassical economics, as, by the way, I've been said very often yesterday, too. This kind of logics establish a peculiar relationship between rationality and value. Rationality is the individual characteristic of a self-maximizing person, and value is conceived in terms of utility. The mediation between rationality and value within this logic is offered by the idea of individual preference. That's why I call it preferentialism. From this combination, economic theory derives a complex vision of efficiency as allocative efficiency or Pareto optimality. To generalize on this distinction, we can say that there are two conceptions of practical reason within a theory of value. According to the first conception is objectivist. There are facts that give us reason to have certain aims and behave coherently with them. These reasons are objective because they refer to objects that make certain outcomes worth pursuing or certain acts worth doing. This is a revisionist logics. There are objects that you should pursue independently from what at the present time you like in some way. So there is a strong claim in terms of goodness. I mean, you should revise your actual preferences in name of an objective value theory. The second conception is instead subjectivist. Reason for action do not depend on objects that make our aims and behavior intrinsically significant. On the contrary, reason for action depend on us as subjects because they are provided by desire and aims we actually have in the present time. Within the first objective conception, value rests on the object that give us reasons to act in order for them to be well pursued and realized. So they are in some way partially distant from us. Within the second subjectivist conception, value rests on the fact that we as subject have interest in some acts or outcomes. So depend on ourselves like subject. Of course, both objectivists and subjectivists can agree upon the fact that we should act in agreement with the best reasons we have. What is different between them is the ground upon which we can maintain that some reasons are better than others. Subjectivists naturally are preferentialists, I said before. The best reason we have depend on our actual present desires as expressed by our preferences. Objectivists instead claim that their aims whose relevance transcends our actual present desires. And by the way, this is why objectivists are in favor of a revisionist approach. According to them, often our actual present desires should be revised, generally speaking, because they invite us to pursue aims not particularly worth achieving. I mean, this is, I think, something to do with the discussion between Tom and Ned yesterday, which I think was one of the peaks of the conference, because usually when you criticize economics in terms of good economics, you stress an anti-preferentialist view, not a more individualist view, but a more objectivist view in some way. That's my argument, that in some way, to say, it's complementary to the discussion of yesterday. At least I hope so. If it's understandable, I do not know how much is understandable, but I think it's in some way connected with it and in some way complementary to the discussion of yesterday, which I found personally particularly interesting and stimulating. Now, I imagine a kind of reconciliation between these two opposite views. Imagining a wide spectrum of position on the moral dimension of economics, we can suppose that at the extremes we have, on the one hand, a purely subjectivist position taken by neoclassical economics, and on the other hand, the objectivist position of deontological ethics. I mean, the reconciliation is needed to overcome this strong distinction. Of course, reconciliation means that there should be something like a mutual reconsideration of the background theories of values. If economists generally conceive of value in mere subjective and self-interest terms, and if ethicists conceive of value in objective and duty-based terms, they should think in terms of a broader theory of value. In particular, economists should abandon the pure subjective interpretation of their theory of value, whereas ethicists should give room to pluralism within their own theory of value. This is the ideal. I mean, to obtain this, I rephrase the Rawlsian distinction between the good and the right. The good consists in the fact that every subject is supposed to be rational in the standard social science sense, and consequently is a potential maximizer of this higher vision of the good. The right consists in a set of limits imposed on the pursuit of the good by a liberal pluralistic interpretation of the social nature of human beings, and by their concrete participation in a historical society seen as a cooperative venture. The right, in this model, is prior to the good, in the sense that all practical deliberation concerning justice, desires, and preference, which define the good of the persons, must be subordinated to the demands of the principle of the right. In other words, the idea of good embodies a subjective interpretation of value, whereas the right introduces elements of an objective interpretation of value. Of course, the thesis that this is a liberal reconciliation, that the right permits to put together subjective and objective in a sound liberal way. To understand why, I will compare the good and right model with another one that, as said before, is the one offered by Caritas in Veritate, the encyclical lecture of the Pope. Here, the core business of the encyclic is an interpretation of business ethics. So it begins like my paper, or vice versa. My paper begins where the encyclic is. And the interpretation is in terms of the common good. In some way, within the Catholic view, the idea of common good plays the role that the right plays in a Rawlsian model. But there is a difference that we will analyze briefly now. The common good of the Catholic encyclic, however, is based on a more comprehensive and profound background than the one behind the idea of right. The background behind the Catholic view presupposes, in fact, a comprehensive reading of human nature. That's why I think it's difficult to construe a moral dimension of economics based on an interpretation of human nature in general, or to put in a more traditional Catholic terminology, a religious anthropology. This means that the preferences of individuals are not restrained by a shared sense of justice, like in a conception of right, but rather by peculiar interpretation of goodness within a specific reading of human nature. To be clear, within the Catholic model, all decent persons are supposed to have analogous values. That's why we speak of common good. So the common good is different from the right. That's the idea, because all persons are supposed to have the same values. If you read the encyclic letter, you have a strange impression, if not probably of schizophrenia, at least of double reading within the document. On the one hand, there is a very mild vision of business ethics that every reasonable person could accept. On the other hand, however, there is an austere vision of Catholic anthropology that it's really difficult to accept if you are not a strict Catholic. Rumors in Rome that say that there are two authors, basically. One group of the authors are colleagues which wrote about business ethics. The other is the Pope in this environment. And the part in which you are, so to say, constrained by the common good interpretation of Catholic anthropology is very, very severe in confrontation. It should be 7. The problem is that economic practice must be rooted in caritas. And this is the objectivist core of these ethical logics. But caritas is not enough. Caritas must be in veritate, which means that it must be founded on truth, where the truth corresponds to the Catholic interpretation of human nature. This is a difficult step. Such strong interpretation of ethical objectivism makes the defense of pluralism hardly possible. In the priority of right model, persons are free to form and revise their conception of the good. In the Catholic social doctrine, persons have to share the same vision of the common good. That's why the first option is liberal, whereas the second is not. Now I go to the final part, the part in which individualism and egoism conflate. I roughly see egoism like a kind of degenerated version of individualism. Of course, individualism is not egoism and egoism is not individualism. There is a strong distinction. Because, to be very trivial, individualism is a methodological, moral, social, political view that stresses the special worth of the individual in itself, meaning any individual. Whereas egoism is a stance according to which each person has only one aim, promoting her own well-being, which is different from any individual, of course. Egoism can be a descriptive or normative position. And the danger is that individualism becomes too near to egoism. The idea is that individualism becomes egoism if the individualist stance does not lend credence to any ethical option that requires the sacrifice of self-interest of the individual for higher social causes. What I'm suggesting is that a pure subjectivist, in terms of theory of value, reading of individualism, brings individualism too near to egoism. In fact, if we assume that the standard theory of value adopted by many economists is subjectivist, we get what is called rational egoism. Rational egoism standardly claims that it is necessary and sufficient for an action to be normatively justified that it maximizes one's self-interest. And what I'm claiming, as you probably understood, is that an egoistic foundation does not permit us to find a proper moral dimension of economics. The diffusion of egoism in Western society has been noted by many intellectual observers. I think that Professor Sennett later will discuss around similar topics in a much more serious way. So I will skip this to say that in a mass egoist society, the moral dimension of economics is lost. That's the idea. The antidote to this transformation, in the best of all possible worlds, is the transformation of individualism into egoism via the acceptation of an objective theory of value that sees the individual part of a liberal democratic community. This is, in part, similar to what Thomas Nagel said yesterday, I suppose. To see how this intersubjective and social side of the person could be used to revise individualistic approaches, dangerously close, in my view, to egoism, we can resort to Rawls again by saying that the person must not be not only rational, but also reasonable. I mean, the rational means what the term normally means in social science, whereas reasonableness includes a more general pretension of normative validity. I am suggesting that we can expand the standard normative meaning of reasonable to make it part of an objective theory of value. This theory will keep its basic individualism, but will not run the risk to become egoistic, because the rational tendency of the subject will be mitigated by the reasonable attitude. Within this theory of value, persons are conceived as both rational and reasonable, where the reasonable introduces an objective element within the theory. Reasonableness, in my mind, is supposed to mitigate the excesses of individualism. A reasonable person cannot be a pure egoist. To be reasonable means to be able to conceive of the relation with others as foundational and primitive. What I think is interesting to think is that this reasonableness assumption, which is a philosophical assumption, can be made a little bit more empirical if you think of many associative links that exist in a liberal democratic society. I'm thinking about trade unions, political parties, religions, that in some way, to use Robert Putnam's sentence, do not permit a person to be alone, to bowling alone. And that's why, in some way, the flourishing of reasonableness is linked with the implementation of liberal democracy, which in its turn requires these mid-level forms of active participation. Egoism, as I conceptualized it, coincides with the separation between the self and the world. So in some way, it looks like what Hegel called atomism. And I think it can be removed through the active participation of citizens in associative groups like the ones I mentioned. In some way, citizenship becomes a mean to let people overcome their partiality or their own conceptions of the good, and an instrument that permits them to take others in serious consideration. Thank you very much for the attention.